Picture this. A maiden's voice rings out across the misty fields of Domremy in the spring of 1429 Anno Domini. The sound pierces the morning fog like an arrow through chainmail. In a humble thatched cottage illuminated only by the faint glow of a dying hearth, 17-year-old Jeanne d'Arc clutches her spinning wheel, her roughened hands shaking with visions that no peasant girl should ever witness. The villagers murmur in their local French dialect, their expressions lined with concern in the flickering firelight. Outside, the Loire Valley awakens with the tentative blooms of wildflowers under a hesitant sun. But inside this modest dwelling, a future liberator of France is being shaped from a young woman who has scarcely left her childhood behind. Jeanne's dark hair clings to her sweat-dampened forehead as another divine imperative surges through her. She is selected, the voices insist. The commands are relentless, unyielding. At 17, her frame is sturdy from years of farm labor, yet her spirit quakes under the weight of responsibilities reserved for monarchs and commanders. And yet, here she stands, summoned to command armies and anoint a dauphin in a nation ravaged by interminable conflict. The irony escapes no one who learns of her saga. This offspring of such unassuming earth will terminate the most sanguinary siege in French annals and ignite the spark that alters the course of the 100 Years' War. Before plunging into these overlooked narratives of devotion and wrath, if you relish unveiling the concealed verities of history, contemplate pressing that like button and subscribing for additional material of this nature. And kindly leave a comment below indicating from where you are absorbing this. It astonishes me that we are jointly delving into these archaic chronicles from diverse locales across the globe, linked through eras and distances by our collective inquisitiveness regarding yesteryears. The young woman prostrate in that abode was no commonplace agrarian offspring. Jeanne d'Arc bore within her essence the blaze of celestial beings, particularly the resonances of Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who addressed her in apparitions that materialized amid the mundane chores of rural existence. But celestial favor, as Jeanne would discover throughout her remarkable journey, could serve as both a boon and a bane. In the ferocious geopolitical terrain of 15th century France, where the 100 Years' War had already devoured generations, such ethereal endorsements rendered one either a priceless instrument or a perilous menace. Jeanne's trajectory to the battlefields commenced years prior, when she was still an innocent child frolicking in the meadows of Domremy. Born circa January 6, 1412 Anno Domini, to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, she emerged into a realm where loyalties fluctuated like the winds and allegiance was the paramount armament of sovereignty. Her father, a prosperous farmer and minor official, perished in her early years under circumstances shrouded in enigma. Some recount that he succumbed to a sudden ailment following disputes with neighboring Burgundians who sided with the English invaders. Others murmured of foul play, for in those epochs, suspicions of toxin accompanied every abrupt demise among the populace, akin to scavengers trailing a host. The particulars of Jacques d'Arc's passing lingered over Jeanne's formative period. He had overseen the village's defenses against sporadic raids during the ceaseless strife between France and England, observing powerlessly as territories claimed by earlier French monarchs eroded fragment by fragment. The ceaseless incursions gnawed at him like a malignancy. Upon his return from a local assembly in 1420 Anno Domini, villagers observed his sunken gaze and unsteady grasp. He uttered scant words, consumed minimal sustenance, and devoted hours to vacant stares. On a chill autumn eve, he was discovered lifeless in his chamber at the family homestead. The formal verdict was a cardiac affliction, but intimates discerned otherwise. Whether by dagger, venom, or merely the burden of perpetual vigilance, Jacques d'Arc had elected oblivion over ignominy. Jeanne's mother squandered no moments in fortifying her daughter's prospects. The resilient Isabelle Romee comprehended the tenets of endurance in a domain where females and youths held worth solely equivalent to the bonds they could forge. By the tender age of 12, young Jeanne commenced experiencing the initial whispers of her celestial visitors, a pact that appeared indissoluble. Yet the turmoil of warfare accelerated faster than adolescence, and when English forces intensified their grip on the region, that nascent calling transformed into an imperative directive. The English occupation's offense had been the protracted subjugation of French soil, commencing with Edward III's assertions in 1337 Anno Domini, terms that incensed the French aristocracy and peasantry equally. Their encroachment was savage even by the norms of the era. Villages razed, harvests incinerated, populations displaced or slaughtered. The dark women absorbed early that perseverance demanded flexibility. Her subsequent revelations arrived promptly, to the archangel and saints who would steer her toward the Dauphin Charles. The divine encounters transpired in the garden behind the family cottage, the identical plot where Jean had expended her youth tending sheep and aiding in the fields. The locale was adorned with wild herbs depicting the simplicity of rural Lorraine, while the nearby church where she often prayed housed the relics of local martyrs. Archangel Michael manifested as a luminous figure in armor, his presence overwhelming yet reassuring. Jean was still maturing from her juvenile attire. The initial communion was a shock that Jean seldom articulated in subsequent accounts, but the indications of its profundity would be inscribed in her unyielding resolve and her lifelong spiritual fervor that verged on fanaticism. Within months of her first vision, Jean's demeanor began altering in manners that alarmed her youthful psyche. The elder women surrounding her conversed in subdued tones about her vocation, their countenances blending awe for a potential prophetess with apprehension for such a youthful vessel. Isabel Romy observed her daughter's evolving purpose with profound unease. She had been in her 20s when bearing Jean, mature enough to navigate maternal duties securely. At 13, Jean was embarking on something that had claimed innumerable lives of women more seasoned and robust than herself. Yet Jean's earthly guardian would never witness the fruition of her daughter's mission. In the fall of 1424 Anno Domini, amid escalating tensions with Burgundian allies of England, Jacques had already departed, leaving Isabel to shoulder the burden. The details of ongoing familial struggles remain obscured, enveloped in the haze of perpetual warfare and covert machinations. Some narratives propose he fell during a skirmish while his kin were dispersed across the valley. Others allude to treachery from within his own community. Whether he perished from pestilence in confinement or was assassinated by his detainers persists as one of history's unresolved enigmas. The epidemic rationale was expedient for his adversaries. Maladies proliferated in medieval hamlets, and asserting natural expiration evaded accusations of slaying a respected yeoman. But contemporaneous scribes noted the dubious rapidity of his decline and the denial of healers to tend him. What is certain is that by 1425 Anno Domini, adolescent Jean was effectively orphaned in spirit, her mother overwhelmed, and utterly isolated in a world teetering on the brink of further devastation. The tidings of her father's fate reached Jean at the village church in Domremy, where she had been seeking solace while the family coped. The herald arrived on a drizzle-drenched afternoon, his mount frothed from the frantic traverse across Lorraine. Jean was in the nave, imploring for her family's security, when the emissary's footsteps reverberated on the stone pavement behind her. She intuited before he vocalized that her universe had fractured. Her uncle, a distant relative, assumed accountability for the bereaved girl. The choice was both benevolent and utilitarian. Jean bore the latent spark of something transcendent, the progeny who might perpetuate their lineage's resilience. He relocated her to the relative safety of Vaucouleurs, a fortified town where sturdy ramparts provided shelter from the mounting anarchy beyond. Vaucouleurs perched on the fringes of contested lands, overlooking the Meuse River, where the winds carried echoes of distant battles ceaselessly against the battlements below. Here, in this isolated stronghold, Jean would confront the most harrowing trial of her nascent existence. The relocation to Vaucouleurs during her intensifying visions was a tribulation unto itself. Spring pathways were scarcely navigable, pitted with mud and obstructed by felled timbers from raids. Jean journeyed on foot, each stride sending jolts through her weary form. The trek that ought to have spanned a day extended to 3 as they circumvented swollen streams and evaded patrols of uncertain allegiance. Vaucouleurs in those seasons was an austere sanctuary, erected on elevated terrain dominating the vista for leagues. Its imposing dungeon, nearly 100 feet lofty, had endured assaults and tempests for generations. But solace was not its intent. Endurance was. The town's quarters were chilly and drafty, heated solely by massive hearths that consumed fuel swifter than attendants could furnish it. Jean's lodgings were draped with coarse fabrics to obstruct the gales that whistled through every fissure in the venerable masonry. The winter preceding her departure to seek the Dauphin was exceptionally severe. Frost coated the interiors of casements, and the river breeze howled through every crevice in the antique stones. Jean, her resolve burgeoning like a storm, could scarcely traverse the length of her chamber without depleting herself. Her essence, still that of a maiden in numerous aspects, labored beneath the onus it bore. The town's healer, a scholarly individual who had pursued knowledge at the academies of Paris and Bologna, assessed her with mounting disquiet. Her visions were too vivid, he confided to her guardians. The mandates too perilous. Manifestation would be hazardous, perchance lethal. Dr. Henri de Lorraine was a man who had attended nobles and serfs alike. He had perused the antique manuscripts of Hippocrates and Galen, attended discourses by the foremost medical intellects of his era, and amassed decades of proficiency in the curative arts. But as he conversed with the visionary girl in his charge, all his erudition appeared insufficient. Jean's constitution was resilient, but her mind was besieged by ethereal forces. The revelations within her were potent, aligned adversely, and exhibited signs of turmoil. He divulged his apprehensions to her uncle during a clandestine conclave in the town's hall. Rain pelted the narrow windows as the duo deliberated Jean's destiny in murmurs. De Lorraine was forthright. He had encountered such phenomena previously, and it seldom concluded favorably for the visionary or their kin. They could endeavor to suppress the voices, but that might shatter her psyche forthwith. They could attempt to delay, aspiring that the divine would recalibrate the summons, but postponement heightened the peril of her isolation and the war's escalation. Or they could facilitate her quest, a course that was nearly invariably fatal to the uninitiated. Her uncle, scarcely 30 himself, confronted the dreadful obligation of determining his niece's path. If Jean faltered, the family's legacy would terminate with her, a young woman with no heirs of her own. If she prevailed but forfeited her sanity, the identical outcome would ensue. The political ramifications loomed heavily, but so did familial devotion. He had developed affection for the courageous, perceptive girl who had confronted loss with such poise. As Jean's visions advanced through the somber months, she exhibited a sagacity that contradicted her age. She devoted her time to absorbing all she could about warfare and governance, intuiting that wisdom would be her mightiest armament in the ordeals forthcoming. Her uncle, awed by her acumen and tenacity, became her mentor in the crafts of resilience. He instructed her to interpret countenances, to discern the unspoken intents behind rhetoric, to comprehend the intricate lattice of coalitions and animosities that regulated society. Jean also immersed herself in sacred inquiry with an ardor that concerned her companions. She spent hours in the town chapel, supplicating before the altar until her knees were raw and hemorrhaging. She committed Latin invocations to memory, examined doctrinal volumes, and cultivated the profound personal bond with the divine that would bolster her through years of strife. Some chroniclers posit that her profound piety originated as a mechanism to cope with the trauma of loss and impending destiny, a means to ascribe significance to anguish that otherwise appeared futile. The town's cleric, Father Guillaume, emerged as another pivotal figure in Jean's tutelage, a local who had been schooled at Reims before assuming vows. He grasped both the classical scholarship of the institutions and the pragmatic politics of existence in a belligerent world. He imparted to Jean that the Almighty frequently operated through mortal intermediaries, that supplication devoid of deed was hollow, but deed directed by supplication could displace peaks. On that fateful day in 1429 Anno Domini, Jean's resolve crystallized with intensities that bent her double. She had been pacing the town's walls, engaging in the reflection that her healer deemed essential for her equilibrium. When the ultimate vision assailed, the mandate was unlike any prior, a resounding, rending directive that seemed to cleave her essence asunder. She slumped against the stone parapets, panting, while her attendants hastened to assist her back to her quarters. The elders, seasoned individuals who had guided countless souls through crises, exchanged laden glances. They had witnessed this afore, a maiden striving to fulfill a celestial edict, nature strained beyond its boundaries by divine exigency. They readied their counsel and uttered their orisons, aware that ere twilight, their charge might be transformed or lost. Elder Marie de Vaucouleurs, the principal guide, was a woman who had aided visions for 3 decades. She had acquired her expertise from her own forebears, inheriting arcana transmitted through lineages of Lorraine women. She knew rituals that could soothe spirits, methods for channeling divine energy, and invocations that appeared to fortify those in communion. But as she conferred with Jean, her lined visage grew somber. The other mentors prepared their implements with solemn efficacy. There were scrolls for recording visions, but also for rites too arcane to ponder. There were herbs and amulets for safeguarding seers, elixirs to bolster frail vessels, and sacred artifacts to invoke heavenly aid. The chamber brimmed with the aroma of smoldering botanicals, thyme for clarity, sage for protection, and other flora whose attributes were known solely to the women who tended revelations and transitions. For days Jean wrestled with her calling in torment that defied articulation, her cries resounding off the stone walls until her voice faltered entirely, leaving only gasping, primal utterances of ordeal. The mentors labored fervently, their efforts dedicated to preserving both the girl and her mission. Elder Marie employed every stratagem in her vast repertoire. Meditation, positional shifts, herbal remedies, and perpetual encouragement murmured in Jean's ear. Her uncle paced the passage's exterior, his footsteps echoing against the flagstones, cognizant that the fate of France might hinge in that chamber. He could auditors Jean's pleas through the stout wooden portal, each one slicing through him like a lance. Attendants scurried by with vessels of warm water and bundles of fresh linen, their demeanors mirroring the severity of the circumstance. Father Guillaume knelt in the chapel, interceding without pause for the young woman whose existence dangled by the slenderest filament. As the visions peaked, Jean's fortitude commenced to wane. She had been in communion for nearly a full cycle of the sun, her youthful form thrust far beyond its confines. The healer, roused from his fitful repose, examined her and conversed in pressing whispers with Elder Marie. The mandate was vivid, but taxing, its essence erratic and feeble. Jean was depleting internally, her vitality faint, her complexion pallid as vellum. The resolution was rendered to attempt direct channeling, a hazardous procedure that might salvage the vision at the expense of the vessel's welfare. Elder Marie had executed the technique previously, but never on one so youthful and untested. She positioned Jean meticulously, supplicating silently to Saint Michael, patron of warriors. As she prepared to guide the divine through the young woman's form and into the world, when the revelation finally manifested, extracted from Jean's essence in a process that nearly annihilated her, the mentors held their respiration. The insight was clear, scarcely articulate, enveloped in ethereal light and profound certainty. For a terrifying instant, the chamber was hushed save for Jean's labored inhalation and the crackling of the blaze in the hearth. Then Elder Marie clarified the message, and the utterance that altered everything permeated the atmosphere. A resolute, commanding decree that proclaimed the mission of Jeanne d'Arc, future deliverer of France. Jean, scarcely aware, her young form fractured by the trial, perceived her purpose through a veil of exhaustion and ecstasy. She endeavored to embrace it, but her faculties would not comply with her will's bids. Elder Marie inscribed the vision on parchment for a brief moment, the customary initial record between seer and divine, before hastening to secure it against misinterpretation. Jean's gaze followed the words with desperate fervor, committing every nuance to memory. The impairment to Jean's being was grave and enduring. The healer, scrutinizing her in the ensuing days, discovered profound spiritual strain and internal conflicts that would never wholly mend. The physician murmured of rent psyches and burdened souls, of energy depletion that had nearly proven mortal. She would never experience such unmediated visions again without cost. This solitary traumatic revelation had curtailed her visionary phase before it had fully commenced. At 17, she was effectively channeled. her prophetic existence offered on the altar of national salvation. The corporeal recuperation was excruciatingly gradual. For weeks, Jean teetered between vitality and oblivion, assailed by fatigue and doubt. The healer applied every antidote in his extensive arsenal, balancing her humors, herbal infusions to combat depletion, and fortified libations with medicinal flora to restore her vigor. Elder Marie never departed her flank, administering sustenance between Jean's parched lips and overseeing every fluctuation in her state. Jean's mental restoration proved even more intricate. The trauma of her ordeal surfaced in night terrors that left her shrieking in the wee hours. She cultivated an acute aversion to solitude, recoiling from even the mildest isolation. Her bond with her divine callers became nuanced by the linkage between their presence and her suffering. She revered them profoundly, but could scarcely endure their summons without being inundated by recollections of the violent revelation. But if Jeanne d'Arc's form was impaired, her resolve remained unyielding. As she convalesced slowly in the months succeeding the vision, she began to manifest the steadfast determination and astute intellect that would render her one of the most influential figures in French history. She comprehended, even in her debilitated condition, that her mission represented the future of the French cause. She also grasped that a village girl with heavenly mandates needed patronage in a world descending toward pandemonium. The 100 Years' War was erupting around them with escalating ferocity. In 1418 Anno Domini, the seizure of Paris by Burgundians had signaled that France would resolve its dynastic quarrels with blade and fire rather than parley. The Armagnacs faced the Burgundians in a strife that would devour the nobility of France for decades. Jeanne, bearer of divine directive through her visions, was now inherently aligned with a faction that was forfeiting territory swiftly. The Dauphin Charles was broadly viewed as feeble, perchance illegitimate, and assuredly incapable of efficacious governance. His adversaries, the English under Henry V, were more formidable but also more despised. Foreign interlopers blamed for France's military catastrophes and the realm's slide into civil discord. Her solution was action. In 1429 Anno Domini, barely recovered from her revelation, she set forth to Vaucouleurs to seek audience with Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the garrison. The encounter was unassuming, nothing like the grandeur that would accompany her later triumphs. Jeanne was still frail, still grappling with her calling, and her new patron was a skeptic selected for strategic utility rather than belief. De Baudricourt was a seasoned soldier, but more crucially, he was a realist who understood that endorsing Jeanne meant harnessing potential divine favor and political leverage. For Jeanne, the endorsement signified validation for herself and her mission, even if it meant confronting doubters whose skepticism opposed her innermost convictions. The arrangement was more alliance than endorsement, a pragmatic resolution to existential threats. The pact negotiated by Jeanne's uncle and de Baudricourt's aides was extraordinarily meticulous, reflecting the convoluted political landscape. Jeanne would retain autonomy over her visions, ensuring her purpose remained pure. De Baudricourt would furnish escort and introduction to the Dauphin. Most vitally, her mission would commence under royal auspices, a stipulation that likely preserved her from immediate dismissal. With the pact sealed in the dim chambers of Vaucouleurs, Jeanne d'Arc stepped into the unforgiving currents of history, her frail form clad in borrowed male attire, a tunic of rough wool, breeches cinched at the waist, and a hooded cloak to shield her from prying eyes. It was February 1429, and the roads to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles VII held his beleaguered court, were treacherous veins of mud and peril, patrolled by English scouts and Burgundian spies. Jeanne's escort, a small band of loyal knights handpicked by de Baudricourt, numbered no more than 6, their horses lean from winter rations. Among them rode her uncle, his face etched with the weight of guardianship, and a squire named Jean de Metz, whose initial skepticism had melted into quiet devotion after witnessing Jeanne's unyielding gaze. The journey spanned 11 days, a gauntlet of frozen rivers and shadowed forests where wolves howled in the night like omens from the abyss. Jeanne rode astride, her cropped hair hidden beneath a cap, her voice steady as she recounted her visions to her companions around meager campfires. "The Lord has commanded me to lift the siege of Orleans," she declared one eve. her words cutting through the crackle of flames. And to crown the Dauphin at Reims, restoring France to her rightful glory. Her escorts exchanged glances, their doubts tempered by the fire in her eyes, a blaze that seemed to draw from the same divine forge that had scarred her soul. Upon arriving at Chinon, the castle loomed like a weary sentinel atop its hill, its towers battered by years of exile and intrigue. The Dauphin's court was a nest of whispers and scheming nobles, where loyalty was a commodity traded like salt. Charles VII, a man of 26 burdened by rumors of illegitimacy and defeat, received Jean in a private audience after days of delay. He tested her, disguising himself among his courtiers, but Jean strode directly to him, kneeling with a certainty that silenced the hall. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, her voice resonant despite her youth, "I bring you tidings from God. You shall be king and France shall be free." Skeptical theologians and clerics interrogated her for weeks, probing her visions with questions sharp as inquisitorial blades. Jean answered with simplicity and fervor, her peasant dialect laced with scriptural wisdom absorbed in Vauquelure's chapel. "My voices come from God," she insisted. "They bid me wear man's garb for safety and lead your armies to victory." Impressed, or perhaps desperate, Charles granted her a suit of armor, a white banner embroidered with lilies and the words "Jesus Maria," and command over a relief force bound for Orleans. The siege of Orleans had dragged on for 7 months, the city's walls crumbling under English cannon fire, its people starving amid the Loire's swollen banks. Jean arrived in late April, her presence electrifying the French troops like a storm-breaking drought. Clad in gleaming plate armor, her standard fluttering in the wind, she rode through the gates to cheers that echoed across the river. "Fear not," she cried from her warhorse. "God fights with us." Her strategy was bold, divinely inspired. Assault the English bastions head-on, ignoring the cautious generals who favored siege tactics. The battles unfolded in a frenzy of blood and faith. On May 4th, Jean led the charge against the fortress of St. Louis, her banner a beacon amid the chaos of arrows and boiling oil. Wounded by an arrow to the shoulder, she pulled it free and pressed on, her cries of "En avant!" rallying the faltering lines. By May 8th, the English, under the Earl of Suffolk, abandoned their positions, lifting the siege in disarray. Orleans was saved, and Jean became La Pucelle, the Maid, a legend whispered in taverns and prayed to in chapels. Emboldened, she pursued the English through the Loire Valley, capturing Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency in swift succession. At Patay on June 18th, her forces crushed the English archers in a cavalry charge that shattered their longbow supremacy, killing thousands and capturing their commander, Lord Talbot. The path to Reims lay open, a miracle in a war that had bled France for 90 years. In July, amid jubilant crowds, Jean escorted Charles to Reims Cathedral, the ancient seat of French coronations. The air thick with incense and the peal of bells, she stood vigil as the Dauphin was anointed with holy oil from the Saint Ampoule, the vial said to have been delivered by a dove at Clovis's baptism. Crowned Charles VII, he embraced her as the instrument of God's will, though courtly envy already stirred like serpents in the grass. But victory's crown was thorny. Jean pressed for an assault on Paris, but Charles hesitated, negotiating truces with Burgundy that undermined her momentum. In September, at the gates of Paris, her attack faltered against reinforced walls, and she was wounded again, this time by a crossbow bolt to the thigh. Dragged from the field, her faith unshaken, she whispered to her confessor, "All is well, God's will be done." The tides turned in 1430. Captured at Compiègne by Burgundian forces while defending a retreat, Jean was sold to the English for 10,000 gold crowns, a king's ransom for a peasant girl. Imprisoned in Rouen, she faced the ecclesiastical court of Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, a pro-English prelate eager to discredit her as a heretic and sorceress. The trial, beginning in January 1431, was a farce of twisted theology and coerced testimony. Accused of witchcraft, schism, and wearing men's clothing, Jean defended herself with eloquence that belied her illiteracy. "My voices were true," she affirmed. I recant nothing that is not against the faith. Tortured in spirit if not body, she briefly abjured under threat of death, signing a recantation with an X. But days later, donning male attire once more in defiance, she retracted her submission. Condemned as a relapsed heretic, she was handed to the secular arm for execution. On May 30th, 1431, in Rouen Old Market Square, Jean was bound to the stake amid a jeering crowd. As flames licked her feet, she clutched a wooden cross, her lips moving in prayer. "Jesus!" she cried as the fire consumed her. Witnesses swore the smoke formed a dove ascending to heaven, and her heart remained unburnt in the ashes. Charles VII, shamed into action, reconquered Normandy and ended the war by 1453, but he did little for Jean in life. It was 25 years later, in 1456, that a papal retrial declared her innocent, a martyr wronged by corrupt men. Canonized in 1920, she became Saint Joan, patron of France, her story a tapestry of faith, courage, and tragedy. Yet in the mists of Domremy, where it began, villagers still speak of the girl who heard angels in the fields. Her legacy endures not in crowns or conquests, but in the spark she ignited, the belief that one voice, divinely touched, can alter empires. From the thatched cottage to the pyre, Jeanne d'Arc reminds us that history's greatest heroes often rise from the humblest earth, their flames eternal against the darkness of doubt.